Good evening, everyone. I hope you have enjoyed the conference so far. It's always a pleasure to be here and to speak to the stronger community. So I'm looking forward to sharing today. And, I really want this evening to be quite informal in the sense that I really want it to be practical. I really want you to, if you have any questions, to ask. And I really want to share some experiences I've had around this and give you some just takeaways that you can literally apply. Because one thing is for sure, if you are pursuing an endeavor, if you are on an entrepreneurial journey, if you are building a business, you will reach this juncture where you will have to decide, are you going to pivot? Are you going to persevere? Now, there's a couple of things I want to say about that. One, it's perfectly normal. I think everyone that has ever tried to do something that God told them to do, whether that be business, whether that be ministry, have reached this juncture where they thought, God, is this actually you? Should I continue? Do I need to pivot? What am I actually doing? So the first thing I want to say to you is that number one, it will happen. Number two, when it does happen, don't be surprised. And number three, it happens. I want to share a few reasons why it tends to happen. Now, the first thing is that it's hard. It is hard, whether you're starting a new ministry and whether you're starting a business, it's actually hard. And it doesn't matter whether you're called to it. It doesn't matter whether you're gifted for it. We will all experience that hardship. And sometimes that hardship means that we reach this juncture. And that hardship is normal. And it doesn't mean that it's not enjoyable. It doesn't mean that we don't love what we're doing. It does not mean that we're on the wrong path. It just means that hard is part of the journey. Remember, nothing great comes at, you hear this saying that may not necessarily be biblical, but it is true that nothing significant is built in our comfort zones. And I think, this entrepreneurial journey, this journey of building something from the ground up, it's a growth journey. And when you're growing, there's naturally growing pains. When you're growing into a new version of yourself, when you're building something that you've never built before, there's naturally growing pains. And so it's hard. So that's the first reason you often reach this juncture. The next is sometimes, and again, this is quite normal, you will feel like you're treading water. There is a period in this entrepreneurship journey, in this building journey, where it will feel like you're treading water and you're not getting anywhere. You're treading, you're moving, but you're not moving. And sometimes that causes you to reach this point where it's just like, okay, God, should I be moving, or do I just need to stop and do something different, right? And then the next reason is sometimes that goal that you set out with, people always say start out with a why you're doing this thing. But sometimes when you're in the day, when you're in the trenches, you can lose sight of that goal. And even if you haven't lost sight of that goal, sometimes that goal can be elusive. It feels like you've been building, and it's not going anywhere. And there's a couple of things I want to say about that. And please let me know if you make sure that you get, let me know if you can't hear me or if you're having trouble hearing me. There's a couple of things that I want to say about that. Now, contrary to common belief, success is built in years, not months. It's built in years, not months. So that treading water is part of the process. And I think, that feeling like you are, because sometimes when you're in the trenches, when you're there, even though you're moving forward, it doesn't always feel like you're moving forward, but take heart and know that you are. But that sense, that feeling like I'm moving and I'm not going anywhere can cause you to be at that pivot point. But not only is success built in years and not months, but we as humans, we tend to underestimate what we can achieve in 10 years and overestimate what we can achieve in a year. And so, but when you're in the trenches, when it feels like you've been moving forever, you can feel like, what is the point? What is the point? And that can cause you to get to that pivot point. And, the decision, or when you get to that point, the decision of what you should do is unclear. And that's why I love this topic. I love that, Matt asked me to speak on this because sometimes this point, when you're in it, you can feel like, oh my gosh, is it only me? Is it only me that's gotten to this point? Is it only me that feels like this? Is it only me? And I want to assure you that it isn't. I mean, it's so common that it's actually in the agenda. And so I wanted to first reassure you that this point is normal. But the question is, when you get to this point where you feel like you lack clarity, when you get to this point where you don't know what you should do, what should you do? Okay. And so the first thing I want to do is share some thoughts on when you get to this pivot point where most of you, this juncture, should I say, that most of you will get to. What do you actually do when you get to that juncture? Now, the first thing that you ought to do is remember, right? And I want to share, and what I mean by that is remember the former things. Like God, there's a scripture that says, like, let go of what is behind and move forward to what is ahead. And yes, 100%, we should absolutely. But the Bible also speaks about us remembering, right? And I want to share a couple of scriptures with you on the importance of remembering, because in these times, remembering will anchor you. Right through Old Testament and New Testament, God says to remember and not forget as a form of encouragement. So we let go of the things behind that are holding us back and preventing us from moving forward. But what we remember is what God has done. And in this point, when you reach this point of pivot or perseverance, it's important to remember what God has done and who He is. Because in this moment, we often feel weak, but you have to remember God says that His power is made perfect in weakness. And so although at this point it may be unclear, although you may not see a way forward, it's important to look to God. It's important to remember what He has done as the first point of call for your decision making, okay? So at this point, remember, and in Deuteronomy 24, verse 9, it says, remember what the Lord your God, in fact, no, let me give you another one. Exodus 13, verse 3, Moses said to the people, remember this day in which you went out from Egypt, from the house of slavery, for by a powerful hand the Lord brought you out from this place. So remember that, remember what the Lord has done, remember what He has done. And so before you make any decision about whether you should pivot or persevere, it's important that this decision isn't made from feelings. It's important that it's made from a place of victory, of knowing that God is with you, that God has got this, and whatever decision that you need to make is in Him. And sometimes that might be pivoting and that might be persevering, but it's remember that God has never failed you and He will not fail you in this decision. And I say that because I've been in it, and I'm going to share some personal stories of where I've been in situations where I've had to pivot or persevere and how I've got through. But in those situations, it's very easy to feel like you're alone, but you're not, and God has the answer for you, and He's placed the answer in you. So the first point is to remember. Then the next thing you want to remember, so you're remembering who God is and what He's done so far, and that He's brought you this far and will continue to bring you to the destination. Then you want to remember your why you're doing this, right? Why you're actually doing this, and is the reason strong enough for you to persevere, or is God saying that you actually need to pivot? And pivot doesn't mean change the whole idea. It might just be a small thing, and we're going to get to that. Point number 2 is you want to be clear on what's happening. So why are you feeling like this? Is it a money issue that's temporary? Is it God telling you, speaking to your heart? Because the why of why you're at this point is super important, because it's very different to want to pivot because you're not making the money, you're not seeing the outcome, and wanting to pivot because you feel like God is changing something that you thought was a path, right? And I've been in both situations, but they're very different. So before you make a decision on whether you pivot or you persevere, and it's important to get to the root of why you're feeling like that. And just to clarify, when I say persevere, and it's probably obvious, but it's to continue on the path that you're on. And if I say, and when we speak about pivot, and when I'm speaking about pivot, it's to change what you're doing completely or partially. And in a lot of cases, the pivot is going to be partial. So it's important also in these moments not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because even though God may be causing you to pivot, it's not necessarily a total change. It could be a slight thing. And I'll give you an example. And I spoke about this at the conference last year. I guess over a year ago now, I am a marketer, as Bailey has said. And I felt like God was telling me to shift my business or pivot my business completely into the aerospace and aviation. And again, it was exactly the same business model. It was exactly the same framework, the 6 Ps, but God was telling me to shift the sector. So even though it was drastic, it wasn't a complete shift. The business model changed, stayed the same. It was completely validated. It was just that God wanted me to focus on a different sector. So when you're thinking about should you pivot, think about the degree of pivot, because it's not always 360. Sometimes it could be 10%. Sometimes it could be little. And sometimes what you're feeling as a pivot that you think may be a full change, it's just God wanting to get your attention about something that you need to do differently. So get clear on what's happening. Try to assess the situation objectively, because it can be very emotive. Number 3 is count the cost. Okay, there's always a cost. So whatever you're doing, there is a cost. And I think there's a scripture, I can't remember it right now, the exact verse, but it says, no one builds a house or builds a house or without first counting the cost, right? So you have to count the cost. And a lot of times, sometimes we find ourselves at this juncture because we have not counted the cost. So count the cost and ask yourself, are the benefits worth paying the price for? If God has told you to do this, and if you can't shake it, then it's worth it. If you feel like actually this was something that I kind of started off my own whim, maybe you went to an event, for example, and it was hyper emotional and you made a decision at the moment, and now you find yourself feeling like, it's not the right thing. Don't be afraid to let it go and change. But equally, if you know in your heart of hearts that this is what you should be doing, you should be persevering. So count the cost and assess whether or not God would want you to pay that cost. Assess whether the benefit of that is worth it. Assess the cost of letting go. Assess the cost. Count the cost. And number 4 is make a decision. A lot of times we think that we sit on the fence for too long, but not making a decision is making a decision. So make a decision. Make a decision with God. Pray about it, but you don't always have to spend weeks, months, or just make the decision and trust that God will direct you. Even if it's the wrong decision, God will always steer you right. But make a decision, okay? Make a decision and then make a plan. When you're often at this point, it's because God is saying to you, something needs to change, okay? Something needs to change. And again, I'm going to give you an example of this because there's 3 points in my business that have been pivot or persevere. Now, the first one was when I first left the corporate world, and the decision was, my options were, do I want to get a full-time job, which was I knew God had told me it was time to start my entrepreneurial journey. The options were, do I leave the job completely? I got redundant, so I had to leave the job. But do I get another job? Do I contract while I'm building my business, or do I contract while I'm doing my business, or do I just quit everything totally? Now, I knew that God had told me that getting a job wasn't for me, so that was out. I knew that contracting, I was still on the fence. In fact, there was pressure for me to contract. Financially, it was the safe option because it meant I could build my business. But I knew that God was telling me to leave, okay? So neither of those decisions would have been wrong. But I knew what God was telling me to do. And in fact, I didn't go full throttle at first. In fact, I did. And then I changed my mind. I got cold feet. And then I did contract, but it didn't work out well. But I always knew God was telling me that I needed to persevere and just go through that season. But that was for me. The other thing at pivot or persevere, you can't follow anybody else's path. You have to really go with what God is saying to you. There's no skipping that work and that level of intimacy that you need to have with him. So that was that first example. The next example was in 2018, 2019, where I had been running my business for, I guess, maybe 3 years, and it just wasn't working. And again, there was this sense that I know that God wants me to step out, but there's something not right here. And we can't, and I think there's 2 parts of this. yes, there's a spiritual side of what God is saying to you, but then there's the practical side, because God expects us to use wisdom. God expects us to operate according to understanding. So it's important to do things like look at others. If it's not working, if you're not actually making money and you're a business, something needs to change. We can't always be so spiritual that we lose sight of the practical indications. We have to look at both the spiritual side, what do we think the leading is, but practically, what are the numbers saying? And that was the place I found myself in. The fact is, God has told me to do something. And I know he's told me to do this. But the fact is, it is not working. And it has not been working for a number of years. So something is definitely wrong. For me to have persevered doing exactly the same thing would have been a mistake. Because yes, you could be following the right goal, but following the wrong path to get to it. So whenever I've been at this point, it's always been God trying to tell me something. God not trying to move me away from the goal or where he's trying to get me, but to tell me that something is not working and something needs to change. And we must not be afraid of change. We must not be so fixed in the path that we have set in our mind that when the facts tell us something different, we're scared to change, right? God calls us to be courageous. God calls us to be strong, okay? And so it's important to look at both sides of the equation. And then the final example is when I felt like God was telling me to launch into aerospace. And at the time, I had finally cracked it. So after 2019, between 2019 and 2022, the business had finally taken off. I'd finally started to make money. And then I felt this check and God saying, okay, now I want you to go here. You validated the business model. Now I want you to take it in a different direction that I never actually expected. But along the path, God will give you signs that you're on the right path. For example, when I chose to go into aerospace at first, and I've been for 1 minute, at first I thought it was completely left base. And then God began to show me stuff and bring stuff to my remembrance, like the fact that my grandparents had a telescope in their back garden. So space has always been in my family. Like in the 1950s, a black family having telescopes in their garden and having books on space on the coffee table. That's not in the suburbs in Northwest London, is quite rare, but God began to bring that to my remembrance. Also, when I told my 99-year-old granddad about Harwell, which is the only place in the planet that has 100 space companies in walking distance, he immediately said, oh, the satellite place. No one in my network knew where Harwell is. And God began to show me that he'd been plotting this path for me. The other thing, in 2019, God told me to change the name of my business, take my name off the business. I named my business the Launch Strategist. When I decided to go into aerospace and aviation, I was like, God, you have a sense of humor. You already gave me the name. That is perfect. And so God began, when I made a decision and was making the decision, God kept on giving me signs. And so look out for those signs, because you can hear God. My sheep know my voice, and another they will not follow. You have to trust that God is speaking over you, and you know whether you need to pivot and persevere, and you know the degree of that perseverance and the degree of that pivot. So trust God and trust the God in you.